They're so focused on waiting for their turn to speak
Oh, yeah.
that they miss crucial opportunities to connect with the other person. Sometimes those moments of quiet can actually deepen the connection. It
Hmm.
shows you're comfortable enough to just be present with the other person.
Ever get that feeling, like when you're in a conversation and it's like your brain just hits the pause button?
Oh, yeah,
You're like, uh.
definitely.
So today we are diving deep into strategies to avoid those awkward silences and actually enjoy talking to people.
I think we've all been there. The good news is, being a great conversationalist is a skill you can develop,
Okay.
not some innate talent you're either born with or without.
Right. It's not like some people just magically have the gift of gab while the rest of us are doomed to awkward silences forever.
Yeah.
So if it's a skill, where do we even begin?
One of the biggest mistakes I see people making is they're treating conversations like a tennis match. They're so focused on waiting for their turn to speak
Oh, yeah.
that they miss crucial opportunities to connect with the other person.
Oh, I've totally been guilty of that. It's like you're so busy crafting your next witty remark in your head that you're not really listening to what the other person is saying.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of the most powerful tools for any conversation, active listening. It's not just about hearing the words. It's about truly absorbing what the other person is saying and responding in a way that shows you're engaged.
Okay, so active listening. How do we actually do that? What does it look like in practice?
Think of it like being a detective searching for clues. You're not just listening to the words, you're paying attention to the tone of voice, facial expressions,
Hmm.
even the pauses and hesitations. All of these give you insights into what the other person is thinking and feeling.
So instead of my mind drifting off to my grocery list, I need to be laser focused on what they're saying and how they're saying it.
Right. And that focus naturally leads to asking follow-up questions that show you're genuinely interested.
Okay, but what if the topic isn't something I'm super passionate about? Like, say someone starts talking about their stamp collection,
Right.
and I'm not exactly a philatelist.
That's where the art of intentional questions comes in. Even if you're not personally interested in stamps,
Uh-huh.
you can still ask questions that encourage the other person to share their passion. You could ask, what's so fascinating about stamps? Or what's the most valuable stamp in your collection?
Those are good. I'm realizing now that I often just jump in with generic responses like, oh, cool, or
Yeah.
that's interesting,
Yeah.
which can be real conversation killers.
Well, those are missed opportunities. By asking engaging follow-up questions,
Right.
you not only show you're listening, but you also subtly guide the conversation in a direction that keeps it flowing.
So it's not about pretending to be interested in something you're not. It's about finding ways to connect
Right.
with the other person's enthusiasm.
Exactly. And that's what the magic happens. When you genuinely engage with someone's passions,
Yeah.
even if they're not your own, you create a sense of connection and build rapport.
This is already making me rethink how I approach conversations. But I have to admit, sometimes even with the best intentions, those awkward silences still creep in.
Hmm.
What about those moments?
Those silences can actually be more valuable than you might think. We're so conditioned to think of silence as awkward
Right.
or
Right.
like a sign that the conversation is failing.
Right, like we're supposed to fill every single second
Yeah,
with words.
exactly. But what if we reframed that? Instead of dreading those pauses, think of them as opportunities to breathe, to process what's been said,
Okay.
and to let the other person collect their thoughts.
So it's less about avoiding silence and more about not letting it freak us out.
Precisely. In fact, sometimes those moments of quiet can actually deepen the connection.
Mm.
It shows you're comfortable enough to just be present with the other person without feeling the need to constantly chatter.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. But I feel like there are different kinds of silence, right? There's the comfortable silence,
Yeah.
but then there's the, oh no, did I just say something weird silence?
You're absolutely right. Not all silences are created equal. And
Yeah.
that's where it becomes an art form.
Yeah.
Knowing how to navigate those different types of pauses.
Okay, so how do we tell the difference? And more importantly, how do we handle those silences that do feel awkward?
Well, let's start with the comfortable silence. It usually feels relaxed, almost like you're sharing a moment of understanding with the other person. You might even notice subtle cues, like a slight smile or a nod,
Uh-huh.
that signal their content with the quiet.
So in those moments, it's best to just lean into the silence and not force anything?
Exactly. Resist the urge to fill the space with nervous chatter. Trust that the conversation will pick back up naturally when
Hmm.
the time is right.
Okay, that makes sense. What about those other silences, the ones that feel more like a communication breakdown?
Those are the moments where we need to flex our active listening muscles even more. Instead of panicking, try to figure out why the conversation stalled. Did you accidentally touch on a sensitive topic? Did you interrupt them before they were finished making a point?
So it's about paying attention to the context and trying to understand the reason behind the silence.
Exactly. And once you have a better sense of what's going on, you can respond in a way that helps get the conversation back on track. For example, you could say something like, I feel like I might have interrupted you. Please tell me more about what you were saying. Or, I'm sensing this might be a sensitive topic. Will you be comfortable talking about something else?
Those are great examples. It feels much more empowering than just sitting there feeling awkward and hoping the silence magically disappears.
Right. It's about taking ownership of the conversation
Yeah.
and guiding it in a direction that feels comfortable for both of you. Now, even when you're actively listening and navigating silences gracefully, there are times when you might feel like you just don't have anything in common with the other person.
Oh, tell me about it. Sometimes it feels like you're speaking different languages, even if you're both using the same words.
I've definitely been there. But remember, everyone has a story to tell.
Yeah?
And often those seemingly vast differences can melt away when we start looking for common ground.
Okay, but how do we find that common ground when it feels like we have nothing in common?
Well, remember those intentional questions we talked about earlier? They're not just for keeping the conversation going,
Right.
they're also powerful tools for uncovering shared interests and experiences.
So instead of asking service level questions like, what do you do for work? We can dig a little deeper.
Exactly. Instead of asking about their job title,
Uh-huh.
ask them what they find most rewarding about their work. Or instead of asking where they live, ask them about their favorite place they've ever traveled to. These types of questions invite them to share more personal, meaningful insights.
Hmm.
That might surprise you.
So it's about shifting the focus from factual information to shared values, experiences, and passions.
Exactly. And you'd be amazed how often you can find common ground in the most unexpected places. Maybe you both have a love for hiking,
Right?
even if you prefer different trails.
Yeah.
Or perhaps you both share a passion for learning new languages, even if you're studying different ones.
This is making me realize that I often give up on finding common ground too quickly. It's like I hit a dead end and just assume we have nothing in common, but maybe it's just that I hadn't asked the right questions yet.
I think that's true for a lot of us. We tend to focus on the obvious differences instead of looking for those subtle threads
Yeah,
that connect
this
us.
has been so eye-opening. I'm already feeling more confident about navigating those tricky conversational moments.
Great.
But I have a feeling there's still more to uncover.
You're absolutely right. There are so many nuances to conversation, and it's a lifelong journey of learning and growth. But with practice and the right mindset, those awkward silences can become opportunities for connection and discovery.
So true. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners
Sure.
before we wrap things up?
I think the most important thing to remember is that conversation is a two-way street. It's not about performing or trying to impress the other person. It's about showing up authentically and being genuinely curious about the other person's world.
So it's more about connection than presentation.
Exactly. And when you shift your focus to connection, those awkward silences become less about you and more about creating a space for shared understanding.
That's a great point. It takes the pressure off. And it reminds me of something we talked about earlier, the power of embracing those silences.
Absolutely. Those moments of quiet can be incredibly valuable for both people. They give you a chance to process information, gather your thoughts, and come back to the conversation with more intention.
It's like hitting the reset button and giving yourself permission to just be present in the moment.
Exactly. And sometimes those silences can even spark new and unexpected directions. For the conversation, you might discover a shared interest you didn't know you had, or gain a new perspective on something you thought you already understood.
So even if it feels a little uncomfortable at first, Those silences are actually a sign that the conversation is deepening.
Exactly. They're an invitation to go beyond the surface level and explore something more meaningful.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much about how to approach conversations in a more mindful and engaging way.
I'm so glad to hear that. And remember, like any skill, it takes practice. Don't be afraid to experiment with these techniques and see what works best for you.
That's great advice. And I think it's a great reminder that we don't have to be perfect conversationalists to have meaningful interactions.
Absolutely. In fact, sometimes those imperfect moments, those pauses and stumbles, are what make conversations more authentic and memorable.
So true. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today. I have a feeling our listeners are walking away with some valuable tools to transform their conversations.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, remember, conversation is a gift. Embrace the silences, ask those questions, and most importantly, be present and curious. You might just be surprised by the connections you create.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive until next time. Keep those conversations flowing. And remember, every interaction is an opportunity to learn, connect, and grow.